let me explain the difference between New York's red flag and Maine's yellow flag. So there are 21 states across the country that have what they call quote unquote red flag laws. I am dramatically, emphatically not a fan of red flag laws. It was one of my biggest beefs with the last administration. Interestingly enough, there was an interview, although he's talked about it on our show. Candidate and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis said he would absolutely not sign any kind of red flag law. He would fight against it as president, which I'm very glad to see because not every Republican is strong or knowledgeable on that. So the difference between what Maine has and what New York has. Maine has a quasi, I'd go ahead and say it's a red flag law. They call it a yellow flag law because they're trying to make it look less offensive because it is a big hunting state. They may be kind of left, kind of purpley, but they do have Susan Collins, who's a Republican. She's a very moderate Republican, but that kind of speaks to the voter makeup of Maine. However, they don't want their 2A rights compromised. So in order to appease the moderates and some people who are not so moderate in Maine, they came up with a yellow flag. And they thought by calling it yellow instead of red, that makes you think that it's less of an encroachment on your rights. Now, there are different approaches that Maine has to the whole flag law that other states are a little bit more ridiculous about. Some states, when you talk about evidentiary standard, you have reasonable doubt, clear and convincing evidence. There are a lot of states that just have basic suspicion, which makes the error rate and the overturning and the problems with this so incredibly ridiculous. Maine has, I believe that what they have is reasonable doubt. And also from the very beginning, they're, I think, one of the only state in the country that actually insists if you're going to talk about removing someone or treating someone as a potential suspect and having their property removed, they want to have a mental health professional involved in the first step. And let's just pause here for a moment, because is that not what it's all about in the first place? You have all these people who talk about red flag laws, and they say that it's because they want a quick way to respond to someone who they believe is a danger to themselves or others. But yet the solution in the red flag law betrays that claim, because all it does is remove property. And it only removes one specific type of property. And there is no agreement of treatment, ongoing treatment, nothing like that. I give the example of the guy in California a couple of years ago who had a red flag law. And California was the first state to pass it. They have the strictest gun laws in the nation, followed second to New York. But the guy, after they enacted a red flag law, and these are all ex parte processes, meaning one side. So the respondent has no idea this is happening until they get a knock on their door, usually. And sometimes it's in the middle of the night. There's a guy in Maryland who lost his life over that. But in California, this guy, when police showed up, they had petitioned the court to have a red flag order invoked on him. And they took his guns, left him there, and then he stabbed his mom to death like a couple of days later. So all it is about confiscating property. If it was about mental health or preventing someone who's a danger to themselves or others, then there would be wrapped up in it some kind of treatment. Not to say protections of due process, which brings me to my second point on this. If someone is dangerous enough to abridge their natural right, then by God, you better have the evidence to lock them up. We are a republic, and we are very, very unique in this world. We have natural rights and we have due process, and you cannot trade due process for the specter of security. It's not going to happen. So in Maine, their yellow flag law, what does make it a little different is that from the beginning, usually in New York, every Tom, Dick, and Harry can petition the court and have a judge make the determination as to whether or not they think you're dangerous enough to have your property removed. I mean, in New York, you can have your coworker, you can have exes, like literally anybody can report you. In Florida's law, which was introduced and signed before DeSantis was even in office there, and they're making their Florida state legislature more and more conservative by the bit. There are still some holdouts in there, which is why they can't get it overturned. But believe me, that's a priority for a lot of conservatives in the state legislature there. But they have a high error rate as well. Dave Koppel had talked about this when he was testifying before Congress a few years back, because the more people that you have that can report for, a wide set of circumstances, the less oversight you have and the higher the error rate you may have. So in New York, anybody can report. In Maine, It's only law enforcement that can petition. And in the very beginning, and I still don't like it, but in the very beginning, you have a health professional involved. So a health professional is involved from step one, and then they evaluate to see whether or not someone is a danger to themselves or others. Then they take that recommendation to the judge, and then based on that recommendation, that individual has X amount of time to turn over their firearms, at which point, if they do not, then police come and seize them. Whereas, you petition the court and then confiscation can happen immediately if they're not transferred to a third party like a trusted friend or family member. So there's some, and the reason I don't like it is because it still is a runaround of due process. Again, I go back to, if someone is dangerous enough to remove from them a natural right, they are dangerous enough to lock them up. You can't, if they're dangerous enough to have their natural rights abridged, then they are dangerous enough to lock up. You must go through the process. We err on the side of freedom, which is why we also make sure that people are able to be their own first responders, because the average response time for law enforcement is anywhere from 19 to 20 minutes, and that's from 2021 figures. So this is all incredibly important to know, because this all factors into this stupid comment that Sarah Haynes said on The View. So she's talking about mental health and all of this other stuff and red flag law, which brings me to the question. This guy, this murderer, he was institutionalized in New York. And I want to point out that this was not like a 2-day hold. In some states, and some states have some discretion here, you maybe get 24 to 48 hours for a hold, like a 5150 in California or something to that, or in Florida, something to that effect. And then at that point, you cannot hold them anymore without probable cause or without proper cause. You have to have a judge involved. This was 2 weeks. So that was a hell of a lot longer than a regular emergency evaluation to immediately deduce whether or not someone was a danger to themselves or others. This guy was institutionalized for 2 weeks. They say he was committed, not admitted, which sounds like it was involuntary. So that immediately, under 18 U.S.C. 922 subsection G, subsection 4, that immediately makes him a prohibited possessor. He would have to go to court, go through a restorative hearing, and have those rights restored, or have them overturned, or end up being convicted and just be or end up having that upheld and being a prohibited possessor after that. So he was in New York when this happened. Here's the process in New York, because New York also has the SAFE Act, and the Bruin case only undid certain aspects of New York gun law that was related to the Sullivan case, etc. That's a separate issue. SAFE Act, what it requires is that if someone is calling in mental health professionals, or if someone is trying to have someone institutionalized, you have to report that to the Division of Criminal Justice Services. And then what they do is they go to the judge, and then they pull the permit. They pull and see if you have a permit, and then they seize your firearms. This is a requirement under law. It's not a feature. It's a requirement of the system. So did that happen? Because if they held him for 2 weeks in New York on that, how was that not done? That's a requirement. And I've heard some people say, well, maybe it was because he was in the Army Reserve. They all go by the same damn laws as everyone else does. That is why back in Sutherland Springs, the Air Force had to settle with all these families, because they failed to report that guy's domestic violence conviction to the National Crime Information Center, as is required by federal law. Their military branches are not exempt from this. But see, that's the thing. There's no incentive for reporting. And I've said before, you can have an argument over whether or not you think the background check system is unconstitutional or faulty, which we probably agree. We'll have a separate discussion about that. But the issue is that when you don't have a requirement to report, or there's no penalty for non-reporting unless it's litigated and there's a settlement, this is what ends up happening. So what happened in this case? Furthermore, if someone is held for 2 weeks like that, there is an adjudication process for their release. Was this guy adjudicated, and the legal term is mentally defective? Was he adjudicated a mental defective? What were the terms of his release? In Virginia Tech, that murderer, which is one of the worst mass casualty incidents in the history of the United States, and it was done with 2 Glocks and not a rifle, that individual had to go through a process to be released. And one of the requirements, one of the conditions for his release is ongoing mental health care. And he did not regularly meet with his doctor. He fell through the cracks. So the people who were assigned to spot warning signs did not. So what were the conditions for this guy's release? That's a huge question that nobody wants to talk about, because they're too damn busy bitching and moaning about an inanimate object that's responsible for the fewest crimes in America annually. that's responsible for the fewest fatalities. Under literal hands, feet, and fists. That's not a joke. FBI, every year, the latest data available is 2021. Their UCR, stand for Uniform Crime Report. They're publicly on this thing called the internet. People can go. They've got a brand new interface. It works seamlessly. Very easy to look stuff up. You can look at it by county. You can look at it by however you want to. But what it shows is that these rifles that everybody's talking about banning are responsible for the fewest homicides annually. So this brings us to Maine. So Maine, did New York let Maine know? Because the guy was apparently domiciled in Maine. He resided in Maine. He did his reserve work in New York, goes back to Maine. Were they made aware? Again, that goes back to, you got to find out, was there a process? Was he adjudicated mentally unfit? Is he a prohibited possessor? I find it weird that no one in law enforcement is telling us this. I'm sorry, but that's BS. That is absolute BS. That's the very least you should be doing, is telling us this. That's not a HIPAA violation. That's public information. Was this guy a prohibited possessor? Super damn easy to answer. Yes or no. Don't sit here and say that it's a HIPAA that's a HIPAA violation, but then freely tell everybody you literally put it out in a damn bolo that he was hearing voices. So which is it? Is it a HIPAA violation or not? Be honest with this information. When people are not forthright, they're covering their asses. If you don't want me to assume that of you, and I really would hate to assume that of anyone who wears a badge, then be forthright. Because I'm immediately suspicious of any governing entity, and that includes even my friends who wear the badge. God love you, but I do. I'm just an American through and through. So I got a lot of questions. So coming up, let's look at the whole situation with Maine. The other thing is, did he obtain his firearm legally? I don't know if you've seen some of the pictures of him running around. The rifle that he has shown holding in the CCTV footage is illegal in New York. So he couldn't have gotten that in New York because it had a detachable magazine. You can't buy that in New York unless you're doing it on the black market, meaning it's illegal because you can't have that feature on a rifle in New York because of New York's SAFE Act. So he either had it before this happened, and then if he had it before it happened and he was institutionalized, they didn't follow SAFE Act and seize his guns as per the law. So you see what I'm saying here? There is a lot of questions because somebody dropped the ball somewhere. There's no matter which way you slice it, somebody messed up.